Hi, these are the most interesting historical photos that I could find. Let's go! Boys only 6 to 8 years old in the Sons of the She-Wolf group were taught the proper fascist salute in 1934. Even the group name came from the wolf in the Romulus and Remus myth, tying very young children to state symbols from the start. On April 6, 1945, 2 United States soldiers escort a Japanese man and a Taiwanese laborer along a palm-lined road on Sanga Sanga in Tawi-Tawi. Sanga Sanga sits in the far south of the Philippines, showing how wide the Pacific War had spread by 1945. Before Hollywood fame, the future star worked as a hostess for Holga Steel Files at the Pan Pacific Auditorium in Los Angeles in September 1945. She was 19 years old, and this quiet trade show job came years before her film rise in the early 1950s. On Utah Beach in June 1944, a United States Navy sailor examines a captured German Goliath, a tiny wire-guided tracked machine. The Goliath was controlled through a cable from a distance and was only about 1.5 meters long. Pat Sullivan and his wife Marjorie sort through a huge pile of entries for a Felix the Cat drawing contest in 1926. Felix was one of the biggest cartoon stars of the silent era, and the mountain of papers shows how famous the character already was. A migrant steeplejack repaired his own car by the roadside in Oklahoma in 1939 during the final years of the Great Depression, when many families had to keep moving to find work. In that era, a failed engine bearing could leave a family stranded for days or end the trip completely. On January 22, 1918, Australian troops carried hot soup to reserve soldiers near Hyde Park Corner at Messines, where winter mud in Flanders often forced supplies to be moved by hand. This breakfast box was part of the K-ration system, introduced in 1942 for fast-moving troops who could not rely on field kitchens. 3 K-ration meals made up one day of food at about 2,800 calories, but many troops had to live on them far longer than they were meant for. Umbrella Rock on Lookout Mountain turned a once dangerous cliff into a tourist landmark in Chattanooga within one lifetime. The same mountain became famous after the 1863 Battle Above the Clouds. In 1982, Larry Walters rose about 16,000 feet above Los Angeles in a garden chair lifted by 42 weather balloons. The flight ended with a Federal Aviation Administration fine, and the chair later entered the Smithsonian. During the filming of Bus Stop in Arizona in March 1956, the actress was trying to prove she could be a serious dramatic performer, not just a studio star. The film became one of the first roles that made critics take her acting seriously. In 1936 Arkansas, many cotton workers lived under a debt system so harsh that a full season of labor could still leave a family owing money. During the Great Depression, families often moved from farm to farm for work with nearly everything they owned in their hands. The battle cruiser Hood was the pride of the Royal Navy until May 1941, when it was lost in about 3 minutes during its first clash with Bismarck. Of the 1,415 men on board, only 3 survived. Sleeping cars turned long rail journeys into moving hotels long before mass air travel became common. By the early 1900s, Pullman berths had become a symbol of comfort and status on overnight trains. Mechanical time clocks spread through offices and factories in the late 1800s and early 1900s, turning work hours into exact payroll records. They also gave employers a new power. Every late minute could now be counted, stored, and used against a worker. By 2000, the White House website had already turned the presidency into a public internet presence, something almost unthinkable just a few years earlier. Whitehouse.gov first went online in 1994, making the Clinton era the first United States presidency with an official White House website. Before 1979, Iran Air was one of the fastest-growing airlines in the Middle East, linking Iran with Europe, Asia, and North America. Images like this come from the last years before the 1979 revolution, when the country still presented itself through aviation, fashion, and tourism. Mount Rushmore was carved from 1927 to 1941, and about 90% of the mountain was shaped with dynamite rather than hand tools. Lincoln's nose alone is about 20 feet long. On April 13, 1918, British troops guarded the canal bridge at Marcoy during the Battle of the Lys, one of the hardest phases of the German Spring Offensive in Flanders. The Lewis gun could fire about 500 rounds a minute. The 1998 Nairobi embassy attack was one of the first major al-Qaeda operations against the United States, leaving 213 people dead and more than 4,000 injured. Most of those lost were Kenyan civilians, and the blast came on the same day as the embassy attack in Dar es Salaam. The 1936 Berlin Olympics were used to present a polished image of Germany to the world and hide how tightly public life was being controlled. During the Games, some street signs targeting Jewish people were temporarily removed. By 1967 in Vietnam, portable flame weapons were already becoming rare because they were heavy, short-range, and dangerous even for the operator. The United States military soon phased them out. In 1931, Poland, even basic schooling could change a village child's future because educational chances in the countryside still lagged far behind the cities. The national census that year found about 23% illiteracy, with rural areas carrying the heaviest burden. King Farouk was the last king of Egypt, and his rule ended in 1952 when army officers removed him and sent him into exile. Only 1 year later, Egypt became a republic, so photos like this come from the final moments of a monarchy that vanished almost overnight. Bruce Lee died in 1973 at just 32, only a few years after photos like this, and just as his films were turning him into a global icon. His son Brandon later became an actor, and his daughter Shannon went on to protect and manage Bruce Lee's legacy. Automatic bars like this made food feel futuristic, decades before self-service became normal in daily life. The Krakow Automat opened on May 22, 1931, and sold beer and sandwiches from coin-operated compartments. By 1942, German supply lines on the Eastern Front were so strained that many units depended on food taken from occupied land. In many Soviet regions, these collections emptied local stocks and left civilians facing hunger before the next harvest. Long periods of waiting led many German soldiers to spend spare hours on carving, model making, and other handwork instead of drills. Photos like this are rare because they show how much of military life was boredom and routine, not constant action. Sold as a supposed floating casino, the unfinished Soviet carrier Varyag was towed around Africa and rebuilt into Liaoning, China's first aircraft carrier. It became the ship that taught China how to launch and recover carrier-based jets at sea. On the Alpine and Carpathian fronts, winter could break an army as fast as combat, with snow-cutting roads, food, and movement for entire units. The Austro-Hungarian army was so multi-ethnic that soldiers at the same trench line often spoke different first languages. In 1958, Yuri Gagarin was still a young naval aviation lieutenant in the Arctic, years before the world knew his name. Just 3 years later, he flew on Vostok 1 and became the first human in space. Churchill painted more than 500 works and once described painting as a shield against stress and dark moods. In 1945, the same year Britain won the war in Europe, voters removed him from office just weeks after victory. By 1932, the United States had spent 12 years banning alcohol, yet the black market had only grown bigger and richer. Just 1 year later, the country repealed prohibition in 1933, after the ban became too unpopular and too costly to enforce. Australian troopers in the Imperial Camel Corps served in a force built for desert travel, with camels able to go far longer without water than horses. The Corps was broken up later in 1918, so photos from Rafah capture one of the last months of this unusual unit. Al Capone arrived at Alcatraz in August 1934, not for the crimes that made him famous, but for tax evasion. He was 35 years old, and Alcatraz had opened as a federal prison just 11 days earlier. In 1963, Fidel Castro began his Soviet visit in Murmansk, only months after the Cuban Missile Crisis had shaken the world. The trip showed that Cuba and the Soviet Union remained closely tied even after the crisis officially ended. Kislaya Guba became Russia's first and only tidal power station in 1968, and at the time it was just the second tidal plant in the world. Its concrete station block was built in a dry dock, towed 100 kilometers by sea, and installed with a method that cut cost by about one-third. Many men sent off to the 1904 to 1905 conflict were entering the first major modern war in which an Asian power defeated a European empire. Russia's defeat at sea and on land helped trigger the 1905 revolution back home. In October 1991, Moscow was sliding out of Soviet rule and into a power vacuum where criminal networks expanded fast. The Soviet Union itself collapsed only 2 months later, turning 1991 into one of the most unstable years in modern Russian history. In 1938, Adolf Hitler, Benito Mussolini, and King Victor Emmanuel III appeared together as Germany and Italy moved closer into the Axis camp. Only 2 years later, Italy entered World War II on Germany's side. Cheap people's radios were pushed into German homes so the state could speak to millions at once. Many sets were built with limited tuning, making foreign broadcasts harder to catch. On November 10, 1989, East German border guards were suddenly standing in a world that had changed overnight, with the Berlin Wall effectively opened after nearly 28 years. Less than 1 year later, Germany was officially reunified. The 1928 banana strike in Colombia exposed the power of the United Fruit Company, whose control over jobs, housing, and exports shaped whole towns on the Caribbean coast. The number of deaths is still disputed today. On April 26, 1989, the Daulatpur to Saturia tornado became one of the deadliest tornadoes ever recorded anywhere on Earth. The storm cut a path about 80 kilometers long through Bangladesh and erased entire villages in minutes. Engineers chased the flying submarine idea for decades, but Reed's RFS-1 became the first craft to actually fly and then submerge. In 1964, it completed a full air-to-water to underwater test, proving the idea was possible even if it was too impractical to change history. In 1935, New York, public events tied to German heritage could also serve as platforms for open pro-Nazi organizing in the United States, before the war changed everything. Only 4 years later, a similar rally at Madison Square Garden drew about 20,000 people in 1939. By the 1930s, visiting Lenin's mausoleum had become one of the most important public rituals of the Soviet state. Millions would pass through Red Square over the decades, turning one leader into a permanent symbol of power. During the German occupation, central Kyiv streets and squares were renamed to erase Soviet identity and impose a new political map. By November 1943, the occupiers had lost Kyiv, turning signs like these into one of the shortest-lived layers in the city's history. In 1934, locust swarms in Palestine ruined crops so badly that whole farming districts faced severe food loss. A dense swarm can hold tens of millions of insects in just 1 square kilometer and strip fields in hours. When Torrey Canyon struck the Seven Stones Reef on March 18, 1967, it spilled about 100,000 tons of crude oil and became one of the first giant supertanker disasters the world had seen. The wreck was later hit by Royal Navy aircraft in an attempt to burn the oil. On June 14, 1966, Douglas B-66 and Republic F-105 Thunder Chief aircraft flew a strike mission over North Vietnam during Operation Rolling Thunder. The F-105 became the main United States strike jet in the early air war and suffered the heaviest losses of any American aircraft type in Vietnam. In the Pennsylvania coal region, boys this young could work 10-hour days for very low pay, picking slate from coal before they were even teenagers. Photos like this helped expose child labor in the United States and push the country toward reform in the early 1900s. In 1954, the Soviet Union unexpectedly asked to join NATO, but the proposal was rejected by the Western powers. Only 1 year later, the Warsaw Pact was created, splitting Europe into two rival military blocs for decades. In 1995, the presidential palace in Grozny had become the main symbol of the First Chechen War and the struggle for control of the city. Within a few years, Grozny would be described as one of the most devastated cities on Earth. After the May 7, 1999 strike on China's embassy in Belgrade, protests erupted outside United States diplomatic sites, including the embassy in Beijing. The incident killed 3 Chinese journalists and became one of the most serious United States and China crises of the 1990s. In 1978, Belfast, even a baby carriage could be stopped and searched as the Northern Ireland conflict turned daily life into a constant security routine. During the worst years of the Troubles, checkpoints, bag checks. In 1995, Russian troops in Chechnya were fighting a war that shocked Moscow by showing how weak and unprepared the post-Soviet army really was. The First Chechen War ended in 1996, with Russia forced into a ceasefire after failing to bring Chechnya fully under control. In 1977, Cuban troops were fighting thousands of kilometers from home in the Ogaden War, showing how far the Cold War could reach. The Soviet Union first backed Somalia, then switched to Ethiopia, turning the conflict into a sudden geopolitical reversal. The Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan ended in 1989 after nearly 10 years, and the war helped weaken the Soviet system from within. Many historians see it as one of the conflicts that sped up the collapse of the Soviet Union just 2 years later. In October 1990, the student hunger strike in Kyiv became one of the boldest public challenges to Soviet rule in Ukraine. The protest helped force political concessions and is often remembered as an early step on the road to Ukraine's independence in 1991. John Thompson posed with his new design in 1916, but it missed World War I and became famous only later in the 1920s. It was first promoted as a trench weapon, yet history turned it into one of the most recognizable weapons of the 20th century. In 1877, much of inland Siam still depended on elephants because roads were poor and railways had barely begun to spread. Within a few decades, modern transport pushed these long elephant journeys out of daily life. In 1945, British ambulance crews were responding to V-2 hits from the first long-range rocket used in war. The V-2 fell faster than sound, so many people heard it only after it hit. The B-24 Liberator became the most produced American heavy bomber of World War II, with more than 18,000 built. By 1944, raids over occupied France were aimed at rail lines, airfields, and fuel sites to weaken German control before the liberation of Western Europe. By the 1890s, Chicago had become one of the great metalworking centers of the United States, feeding railroads, bridges, and the rise of modern skyscrapers. Furnace work often meant extreme heat, dust, and shifts that could stretch to 12 hours or more. In 1966, Rita Faria had just become the first Miss World from India and the first Asian winner in the pageant's history. She later turned away from show business and chose a medical career instead. On Omaha Beach in June 1944, Catholic chaplains held Mass and final prayers within hours of the Normandy landings, on the beach where American forces faced the hardest resistance. More than 34,000 United States troops came ashore there on June 6, 1944. On February 8, 1983, New York police detained a young man after a reckless game ended in tragedy. In the early 1980s, cases like this fed the city's harsh tabloid culture, where one arrest could become front-page news overnight. In February 1945, Iwo Jima became one of the costliest Pacific battles for the United States, with nearly 7,000 Marines lost before the island was secured. Its airfields later proved so valuable that more than 2,400 damaged B-29 bombers made emergency landings there. During the Second World War, Soviet partisan raids in eastern Finland sometimes hit remote civilian settlements far from the main front. In 1941, border families could lose their homes overnight and still keep living on the same burned ground. At Khalkhin Gol in 1939, the undeclared border war between Japan and the Soviet Union ended in a sharp Soviet victory that stunned Tokyo. Many historians see that defeat as one reason Japan later turned south toward the Pacific instead of trying to invade Siberia. On August 24, 1991, Ukraine's parliament adopted the Act of Declaration of Independence as the Soviet Union was starting to break apart. Only 4 months later, the Soviet Union itself ceased to exist, turning this flag into the symbol of a new state. In 1963, Oskar Schindler was honored by Yad Vashem for saving about 1,200 Jews by keeping them on factory lists during Nazi rule. He was buried in Jerusalem in 1974, and his story later reached a global audience through the book and film Schindler's List. The 1988 Ramstein airshow crash became one of the worst airshow disasters in history when an Italian MB-339 struck the crowd in West Germany. After it, Germany sharply tightened airshow safety rules, and many countries pushed aerobatic displays farther from spectators. In 1943, street unrest in Danish cities helped end the policy of cooperation between Denmark and German occupation authorities. Only weeks later, German forces took direct control, and that same autumn, most of Denmark's Jewish population escaped to Sweden. In January 1969, Taiwanese Marines were still training with portable flame weapons, even as many armies were already moving away from them. By the late 20th century, these heavy short-range systems were fading from regular service. On March 18, 1965, Alexei Leonov became the first human to step into open space during the Voskhod 2 mission. His suit swelled so much in vacuum that he had to release air by hand before he could squeeze back through the hatch. Wobbelin was opened only in 1945, when collapsing Nazi camps pushed prisoners west in the final weeks of the war. United States troops reached it on May 2, 1945, and found people left without enough food, medicine, or transport, even at the very end. On August 14, 1962, French and Italian crews finally broke through under Mont Blanc after digging from opposite sides of the Alps. The tunnel opened in 1965 and became one of the first great road links to cut directly beneath Europe's highest mountain. In late 1941, Los Angeles, some Japanese-American business owners were trying to prove loyalty to a country that would soon turn against their own community. In 1942, about 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry were forced from the West Coast into camps. For many Soviet troops, Afghanistan became a war with no clear victory and a harsh landscape that wore down morale for nearly 10 years. The conflict ended in 1989, and many historians see it as one of the wars that sped up the collapse of the Soviet Union just 2 years later. In 1968, troops were sent into Mexico City as the student movement grew only months before the Olympic Games. The unrest did not stop, and by October 2nd, the Tlatelolco crackdown shattered Mexico's image of stability before the world arrived. By 1943, even German generals were being led into Soviet captivity as the balance on the Eastern Front swung hard after Stalingrad. That year marked the moment when the Red Army stopped merely holding the line and began breaking German power in the East. On April 27, 1986, Kiev doctors were sent toward Chernobyl before the full scale of radioactive exposure was clearly understood. That same day, nearly 50,000 people were evacuated from Pripyat, less than 3 kilometers from the reactor. In 1918, Damascus stood at the center of the final Allied drive against the Ottoman Empire, where a single intelligence contact could affect an entire front. That same year, Ottoman rule in the city collapsed after nearly 400 years. On January 17, 1991, Baghdad became one of the first cities in history where the opening hours of a major war were watched live by viewers around the world. Operation Desert Storm lasted only 43 days and marked a new era of warfare built around stealth aircraft, cruise missiles. Before the Easter Rising of 1916, members of the Irish Citizen Army were preparing for a revolt that would reshape modern Ireland. The uprising lasted only 6 days, but the execution of 16 leaders helped turn public opinion toward independence. In 1900, Nome exploded almost overnight after gold was found not only inland, but even in the beach sands along the Bering Sea. By that year, its population had surged to about 12,000, making it one of Alaska's biggest boomtowns in a place with no deep harbor. In 1968, Viet Cong tunnel networks let fighters hide, move supplies, and survive repeated attacks while staying almost invisible from above. Tunnel clearing became one of the most feared jobs of the Vietnam War because the passages were narrow, dark, and often trapped. Roger Bannister broke the 4-minute mile barrier in 1954, smashing a limit many people had believed the human body could not cross. His record lasted only 46 days, but after that run, the impossible suddenly became repeatable. Franco's victory in 1939 ended the Spanish Civil War and began nearly 36 years of authoritarian rule in Spain. He stayed in power until 1975, making scenes like this the opening image of a regime that lasted a generation. General Azolino Hazon, head of the Carabinieri, lost his life during the first Allied air attack on Rome in July 1943. Only weeks later, Mussolini fell from power, turning that summer into the breaking point of fascist Italy. After Mussolini fell in 1943, Italy split in two, and units like this kept fighting for the German-backed Italian Social Republic in the north. The Solothurn S-18-1000 was a 20mm anti-tank rifle, but by the last war years, it was already losing value against newer armor. In 1942 to 1943, anti-communist militia units in occupied Yugoslavia often fought alongside Italian forces against Tito's partisans. The war in Yugoslavia became so fractured that occupiers, royalists, local militias, and communist fighters could all be battling in the same region at once. In 1936, fascist Italy used banned mustard gas in Ethiopia while publicly denying it. The invasion exposed how weak the League of Nations had become, failing to stop one of the clearest uses of banned gas between the two world wars. By April 1944, Mussolini had already been removed from power once and returned only under German protection. He was now leading the Italian Social Republic, a breakaway state in northern Italy that survived for barely 2 years. Francis Pegamagabao of the Wasauksing First Nation became one of the most decorated Indigenous soldiers in Canadian history during World War I. By 1919, he had earned the military medal with 2 bars. In 1941, the Ustasha regime in the independent state of Croatia used forced conversion as part of a wider campaign against Serbs. It showed that in wartime Yugoslavia, even a person's name, faith, and identity could be rewritten by the state. By 1973, McDonald's had already grown from a small California burger chain into a fast food giant, and Ronald McDonald was becoming one of the most recognizable advertising characters in America. The mascot had been introduced only 10 years earlier in 1963. In 1863, real battle action was almost impossible to capture, so Civil War photographers often staged scenes for the camera. This mock fight near Falmouth shows how even some famous wartime images were part record and part performance. In 1911, a nurse at the bedside signaled modern medical care, but most American births still happened at home or in small private rooms, not big hospitals. Around that era, about 1 in 10 babies in the United States did not reach their first birthday. By 1880, sumo had already lasted for centuries and was surviving the huge changes of the Meiji era, when Japan was rapidly remaking itself. Only 29 years later, Tokyo opened the first permanent Kokugikan arena. In 1864, cheap tin-type photos let Union soldiers capture their faces in minutes and mail the image home during the Civil War. These small portraits became some of the most personal records of the war because many soldiers who posed for them never sat for a camera again. While we're looking at these photos, don't forget to write in the comments. Which historical shot did you like the most? And for what reason? A Kurdish fighter uses a DSK, a heavy gun first designed in 1938 to target aircraft during the 1991 uprising in northern Iraq. The revolt erupted just after the Gulf War and helped break Baghdad's control over much of the north for a crucial moment. Ion Antonescu, Romania's wartime dictator, is seen in 1946, just moments before his sentence was carried out after his conviction for war crimes. His regime helped drive the Holocaust in Romania, where up to 400,000 Jews and Roma were killed. In 1918, Harry S. Truman was a First World War captain who commanded an artillery unit in France after years of working as a farmer and bank clerk. In 1945, that same officer became President of the United States and helped shape the final months of the biggest war in history. In 1941, a border pass like this could decide whether a Norwegian civilian could legally move near one of the most tightly controlled frontiers in Europe. Neutral Sweden became a lifeline during the war, and more than 50,000 Norwegians crossed that border. In May 1945, Hermann Göring, one of the most powerful men in Hitler's regime, faced American questioning after surrendering as the Third Reich fell apart. Only days after Hitler died, the man once named as his successor was sitting under guard instead of giving orders. At Live Aid in Wembley in 1985, famous guests watched from the stands during a concert that became one of the biggest charity events ever staged. The broadcast reached about 1.5 billion viewers worldwide and helped raise more than £125 million for hunger relief. In 1947, Jewish refugees reached Haifa, carrying a plea after Europe's anti-Jewish persecution had erased whole families and communities. Between 1946 and 1949, Britain held more than 50,000 Jewish refugees in camps on Cyprus before many could enter Palestine. In 1981, Susan Barnes Carson and Michael Bear Carson shocked California after claiming visions had sent them to hunt people they called witches. Their case ended with convictions for 3 killings and became one of the strangest cult crime stories of the decade. Before becoming world famous for his bold drawings, this Finnish wartime officer served in the army during the Second World War. He later turned the look of uniforms into one of the most recognizable visual styles in modern art. George Washington Morrison Nutt became a Barnum star in the 1860s and even met Queen Victoria. His rivalry with General Tom Thumb turned 2 very short performers into one of the strangest celebrity acts of the 1800s. Millie Hull became a famous tattooed performer and ran her New York tattoo shop for 25 years. In a trade dominated by men, she used her own fully tattooed image to build one of the city's earliest woman-run studios. Annie Jones became one of the most famous circus stars of the 1800s and later pushed Barnum and Bailey to drop the word freak from its ads. When she died in 1902 at age 37, she had already turned her condition into fame, money, and a rare public fight for dignity. On May 10, 1974, store owner Rowena Jones stood outside her grocery at 21st Street and Diamond Street with Officer Lafayette Kaysen. One frame preserves the shop, the owner, the patrolman, and the exact corner in 1974. In 1953, 27-year-old Elizabeth II toured New Zealand during her first great Commonwealth journey after the coronation. She became the first reigning monarch ever to visit the country. In December 1951, London clubs like the Sunset were already pulsing with post-war dance and jazz energy. Just 6 years after the war, the city's nightlife was being reshaped by American music, uniforms, and a faster social world. In 1944, the B-24 Liberator, It Ain't So Funny, carried a rare nose mural packed with comic characters instead of standard pin-up art. Donald Duck, Popeye, and Catwoman turned one bomber into a near-unique flying cartoon wall. In 1954, Francisco Franco and Rafael Trujillo stood together, two rulers who had already silenced opposition in Spain and the Dominican Republic. By the time both regimes ended, they had held power for nearly 70 years combined. In April 1945, American troops entered Duisburg as the Ruhr collapse sealed the fate of Germany's biggest industrial region. Within weeks, the war in Europe was over, in May 1945. On the 7th of February 1958, Ho Chi Minh met Jawaharlal Nehru in New Delhi, bringing together two of Asia's most important anti-colonial leaders. Just 7 years later, the Vietnam conflict would explode into a far bigger war. Sergeant Harant J. Dekranian, born in 1923, served as a B-24 tail gunner and died in 1944 at just 21 years old. His bomber was hit after a raid over Vienna, and he was later awarded the Air Medal and Purple Heart. Before giant balloons took over Thanksgiving parades, marchers used stilt costumes, oversized masks, and handmade figures like these. Early holiday parades could look far stranger than the polished float shows people know today. Fresh extras announcing war and the bombing of Poland turned one street corner into a public shock in 1939. Before television, a newspaper stand could be the first place an entire city learned the world had changed. Around 1910 in Minneapolis, washing clothes could take a full day before ironing even began. Many homes used heavy irons heated on a stove, turning clean laundry into one of the hardest weekly jobs. In October 1973, older Americans marched as inflation began crushing fixed incomes. Within months, the oil crisis would drive prices even higher across the United States. In January 1944, a 240mm howitzer of the 697th Field Artillery Battalion prepared to fire near Mignano during the fight for Italy. Camouflage nets hid one of the heaviest American field guns used against German positions on the Gustav Line. In Tehran in 1986, a marriage bureau arranged meetings between women volunteers and Iranian war veterans during the Iran-Iraq War. One candidate was introduced to Bahman, a veteran blinded and permanently disabled by a landmine. On the 7th of June 1944, Easy Company stood in Sainte-Marie-du-Mont after landing behind Utah Beach during the Normandy invasion. This small airborne unit later became one of the most famous companies of the Second World War. Irving Penn turned a Pullman porter into a 1951 icon by loading one worker with bags until he looked almost swallowed by the job. Decades later, this image sold for $70,400 at auction. In May 1945, Hermann Göring was in American custody only weeks after standing near the top of Hitler's regime. Early on, some United States officers treated the fallen strongman with surprising ease, allowing interviews, conversation, and meals with officers. In 1951, Iraqi Jewish families arrived at Lod during Operation Ezra and Nehemiah, one of the largest airlifts in the region's history. Between 1950 and 1952, more than 120,000 Iraqi Jews were flown to the new state of Israel. In July 1931, Oklahoma Governor Alfalfa Bill Murray visited the Red River Bridge standoff after sending National Guard troops into a tense border dispute with Texas. A fight over one toll bridge had grown so big that two American states were facing each other with soldiers. In 1930, Corneliu Zelea Codreanu was building the Iron Guard into one of Europe's most extreme far-right movements. By 1938, Romania's king had turned on him, and the man behind the movement was dead in custody. At Nuremberg in 1945, Gerd von Rundstedt sat in headphones after 52 years in uniform as the highest-ranking German army officer left from the war. He knew about plots against Hitler, but never openly joined them or tried to stop them. In the 1980s, some Sikh couples in Punjab were pulled directly into India's separatist conflict instead of watching it from the sidelines. After 1984, the crisis spread across the region and lasted for years before fading in the 1990s. In February 1944, German mountain troops moved into the Monte Cassino line, one of the toughest fronts in Italy. Snow, cliffs, and the high ground helped turn Cassino into a months-long deadlock. In Crimea in 1944, this German non-commissioned officer wore a chest full of awards from years of fighting on the Eastern Front. By that year, the front was collapsing, and even heavily decorated veterans could not stop the Soviet advance. In 1948, many Palestinian families fled or were driven from their homes during the war surrounding Israel's creation. Palestinians remember this rupture as the Nakba, which displaced about 700,000 people. In 1967, Robert Lawrence Jr. became the first black astronaut chosen by the United States, then stunned reporters when one asked if he would have to sit in the back of the capsule. Less than 6 months later, at age 32, he was lost in an F-104 crash and never got the chance to reach space. In May 1945, a Soviet IS-2 stood beside the ruined Brandenburg Gate as Berlin fell. Its 122mm gun was built to smash heavy defenses, and this moment marked the final collapse of Hitler's regime. Elliot Roosevelt was Theodore Roosevelt's younger brother and the father of future First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. He died in 1894 at just 34, long before his daughter became one of the most influential women in American history. On April 20th, 1945, Soviet tanks entered Berlin on Hitler's 56th birthday. 12 days later, Berlin had fallen, and the regime he built was finished. In April 1943, German forces moved through Warsaw during the Ghetto Uprising, one of the boldest resistance battles of the Second World War. Outgunned Jewish fighters held on for weeks before the ghetto was systematically destroyed. In 1918, the Red Baron, the most famous flying ace of the First World War, was photographed with his dog Moritz near the end of his short life. He was only 25 and had already been credited with 80 air victories. In the 1860s, Circassian fighters were photographed after resisting the Russian Empire through one of the longest wars in the Caucasus. In 1864, the conflict ended with mass expulsion, and most Circassians were driven into the Ottoman Empire. In 1983, a wedding moved through ruined Beirut, while the Lebanese Civil War was still tearing the city apart. One white dress in a shattered street turned the city's divide into a single unforgettable image. In July 1967, a police raid on an after-hours bar ignited 5 days of upheaval in Detroit. The crisis left 43 lives lost and more than 2,000 buildings damaged or destroyed. John Johnson became one of the Wild West's darkest legends after 1847, with stories claiming he hunted Crow warriors for years after his wife's death. Much of his tale was later blurred by myth, but his nickname alone turned him into frontier folklore. On November 24, 1943, Soviet women snipers Bykova and Skripnikova returned from a mission on the Eastern Front. The Soviet Union trained more than 2,000 women snipers, making scenes like this one of the war's most unexpected realities. In 1880, an Ainu man was photographed from the indigenous people of northern Japan. Within decades, state policies pushed many Ainu to lose land, language, and traditional dress. In 1915, Effie Hotchkiss and her mother Avis rode a Harley-Davidson from Brooklyn to the Pacific and back, carrying Atlantic Ocean water west to meet the other shore. They completed about 15,000 kilometers. In 1918, defeated Reds were rounded up in Tampere after the Finnish Civil War ended. More than 80,000 people were detained across Finland, and about 13,500 died in prison camps from hunger and disease. In September 1919, British Lieutenant Donald Grantham posed at Lake Onega with chemical bombs during the Allied intervention in the Russian Civil War. This image comes from a nearly forgotten moment when British forces were operating deep inside northern Russia after the First World War. On April 14, 1945, 6 Soviet Il-2 aircraft wrecked Panzerzug 76 in East Prussia. The strike came less than 1 month before Germany surrendered in May 1945. In 1918, Italian Arditi shock troops tested heavy steel armor, creating one of the strangest combat images of the First World War. Their real power came from speed and close assault tactics, not from these rare metal suits. In September 1930, the German airship LZ-127 photographed Moscow with the Cathedral of Christ the Savior still standing by the river. Just over 1 year later, the cathedral was demolished, making this one of its last views before it vanished. At the 2002 Sknyliv Air Show, a fighter jet slammed into the crowd in the deadliest air show disaster on record. 77 people were lost, including 28 children, and more than 500 others were injured. On May 3, 1992, a United States Marine guarded a supermarket in Compton as Los Angeles unrest spread across the city. The crisis followed the Rodney King verdict and brought federal troops into the streets within days. Cléo de Merode became one of the most famous faces of the Belle Époque in the 1890s, when dancers could become international celebrities. Her image was reproduced across Europe so widely that fame itself became part of her performance. In 1943, Ralph Lazo entered a Japanese-American camp by choice to stand with friends forced inside. He remains the only known American to volunteer for life in the camps. In 1978, many Belfast children were growing up with barricades and street unrest as part of daily life during the Troubles. The conflict lasted about 30 years and cost more than 3,500 lives. In November 1989, Prague students filled the streets in protests that helped break communist rule in Czechoslovakia. Within weeks, the Velvet Revolution pushed the old regime out without a civil war. On April 21, 1945, central Berlin was already a ruin as the Third Reich entered its final days. 9 days later, Hitler was dead, and less than 3 weeks after this photo, Germany surrendered. In 1995, Timothy McVeigh carried out the Oklahoma City attack, then the deadliest act of domestic extremism in United States history. It took 168 lives, including 19 children, and destroyed the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building. In 1941, Dmitry Shostakovich served as a volunteer fire watcher in blockaded Leningrad during one of the war's longest sieges. That same year, he began his Seventh Symphony, which became the city's most famous musical symbol. In 2002, Thai monk Mahasayan Jirasupo shocked Bangkok by entering the parliament reception with a rifle to protest police treatment. The standoff lasted about 40 minutes before it ended, turning one grievance into one of Thailand's strangest modern protests. In 1972, Spanish mail carrier Gabriel March Grandos was sentenced to 384,912 years after destroying 42,768 letters instead of delivering them. The court counted 9 years for each letter, turning postal laziness into one of the most absurd sentences on record. In 1929, Bedouins gathered by a fire in Sinai, a desert peninsula linking Africa and Asia. For centuries, Bedouin routes across Sinai connected Egypt, the Levant, and the Red Sea. In 1992, fighters at a Transnistria checkpoint stood inside one of the first post-Soviet wars. That short conflict froze the region into a breakaway state that still exists in limbo. In August 1991, people in Moscow climbed onto tanks during the failed coup that tried to save the old Soviet system. 4 months later, the Soviet Union no longer existed. In 1969, Apollo 11 captured the moon's surface just after the first human landing there. Those sharp footprints can remain for millions of years because the moon has no wind or rain. In 1900, Russian guards on the Chinese Eastern Railroad posed with arrested Honghuzi in Manchuria. That railway gave Imperial Russia a direct route across northern China just 4 years before the Russo-Japanese War. On August 13, 1972, 67-year-old Karl Wallenda crossed a high wire 140 feet above a packed Phillies stadium between games of a doubleheader. Halfway across, he stopped for a headstand and earned $3,000 for it. In February 1954, Marilyn Monroe flew to Korea and performed for about 100,000 United States troops in just 4 days. The tour turned one film star into a morale event so huge that soldiers packed the stages just to see her. In occupied Venice, 2 Luftwaffe officers pause in St. Mark's Square while daily life still moves around them. After Italy broke with Germany in 1943, Venice remained under German control until the final months of the war. In September 1992, South Korean preacher Lee Jang-rim was arrested after a failed prophecy claimed the world would end on October 28th. Some followers reportedly sold homes and quit jobs, turning the prediction into one of the country's most notorious doomsday cases. In January 1942, German troops crossed ruined Kulm during a Soviet siege that trapped about 5,500 defenders behind the front. The pocket held until May 1942, making Kulm one of the Eastern Front's earliest long sieges. In November 1952, Britain began mass detention in Kenya as the Mau Mau emergency spread across the colony. The crackdown later swept tens of thousands of Kikuyu into camps and fenced villages. A German soldier is photographed beside a burning house, but the place and date are unknown. The missing caption leaves only one clear fact: the camera caught a home already being destroyed. In 1953, Mau Mau suspects in Kenya were marched to court with numbers hanging from their necks instead of names. Under British colonial rule, mass trials could reduce people to case numbers. In 1957, the Piasecki 5Z-8 air jeep was tested as a low-flying scout for the United States Army. It looked like a flying jeep, but the project never moved beyond the experimental stage. In 1916, wounded French soldiers drilled inside the Grand Palais, the huge Paris exhibition hall turned into a wartime recovery center. Even one of France's grandest buildings was repurposed to send men back to the front. I will be very grateful for your subscription to the channel. Every day I try to tell you about such interesting historical photos.